She gets the house, the accounts, and 50% of the business. My attorney's voice was flat, professional, like he was reading a grocery list instead of the dismantling of 15 years of my life. If you've ever watched someone walk away with everything you built while smiling the whole time, stay with me. This is family betrayal verdict. I sat across the conference table, my hand gripping the pen so tightly my knuckles had gone white, the cold metal barely registering against skin that felt numb from the inside out. That's everything, Diane, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. My ex-wife didn't look up from her own copy of the settlement, her expression composed, almost serene, the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this moment far longer than I had. It's what's fair, Tom, she said. Given everything. Given what, exactly? 15 years of building that business together? Are we pretending that started with you? Her attorney, a sharp-suited woman named Vanessa Cole, cut in smoothly. The terms have been thoroughly reviewed by both parties. I'd encourage you to sign so we can all move forward. I looked down at the document one more time, the words blurring slightly as my eyes moved over clause after clause, each one carving away another piece of the life I'd spent over a decade constructing. The house. The savings. Half the business I'd started in my garage before Diane and I had even married. I built that company before I ever met you, I said, my throat tightening around the words. And I spent 15 years helping you keep it running, she said, her voice carrying just enough practiced hurt to make my own attorney glance at me with something like caution. You wouldn't have half of what you have now without me, Tom. I signed. My hand moved almost independent of my will, the pen scratching against paper in a room gone suddenly too quiet, too bright under the fluorescent lights overhead. The moment the ink dried, Diane's shoulders relaxed slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all morning. Thank you for making this easy, she said, gathering her copies with brisk efficiency. Easy, I repeated. Is that what we're calling this? She didn't answer. She simply nodded to her attorney and left the conference room, her heels clicking steady and unhurried against the tile floor, the sound fading down the hallway long after she'd disappeared from sight. My attorney, David, waited until the door closed fully before turning to me. You okay? No, I said honestly. But I signed it anyway. For what it's worth, the terms weren't unreasonable given the length of the marriage. Courts tend to. I don't need the legal explanation right now, David. I need a minute. He nodded, gathering his own papers, giving me the silence I'd asked for. I sat alone in that conference room for a long time after everyone else had gone, staring at my copy of the settlement, the weight of it heavier in my hands than the paper should have allowed. My phone buzzed. My sister, Rachel. How did it go? She got everything, I said. The house, the accounts, half the business. That can't be right. You started that company years before you two even met. Apparently that doesn't matter as much as 15 years of marriage does. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Tom, I know this is awful. But maybe it's time to just let this chapter close. She just wants to move on. Don't make it uglier than it already is. I'm not trying to make it ugly, Rachel. I'm trying to understand how I ended up with nothing. You'll rebuild, she said, though the reassurance felt thin, practiced, the same kind of comfort people offer when they don't fully understand the depth of what's actually been lost. I drove home that evening, though it wouldn't be mine for much longer, the house already listed for sale according to the settlement terms, 30 days to vacate the only place I'd lived for the past decade. I walked through empty rooms that still held our shared history, the kitchen where I'd taught myself to cook after long nights at the office, the study where I'd first sketched out the prototype that eventually became the foundation of my company. My private memory arrived uninvited, the way it always seemed to in moments like this. Diane, 10 years younger, standing in that same garage, watching me solder together my first working prototype, her face lit with genuine excitement, genuine belief in something we hadn't even fully understood the potential of yet. We're going to build something incredible together, Tom. I hadn't understood, then, how differently "together" would eventually come to mean. I sat on the floor of my empty study, the settlement papers spread out before me, my hands trembling slightly as I began reading through them one more time, slower this time, more carefully. Something caught my eye on page 14, a clause I'd skimmed past too quickly during the actual signing, exhausted and eager simply to have the ordeal over with. Section 14.3, future intellectual property developed under existing patent framework remains subject to prior ownership terms as established in original filing documentation. I read it 3 times, my mind working slowly through the legal phrasing, something about the wording nagging at a memory I couldn't quite place yet. I pulled out my laptop and began searching through old files, old emails, anything related to the company's original patent filings from years before Diane and I had even started dating. I found the original documentation eventually, dated 2 full years before our wedding, the patent for the core process that had become the backbone of everything the company now did. I saved copies of everything, the settlement agreement, the original patent filing, the email correspondence confirming the dates, into a folder on my laptop, my hands steadier now than they'd been all day. I didn't fully understand yet what I was looking at. I only knew, sitting alone on the floor of a house that would soon no longer be mine, that something about that oddly specific clause deserved a much closer look than I'd given it in that conference room. Whatever Diane and her attorney had intended when they inserted that language, I intended to understand exactly what it protected, and exactly what it might mean for everything she believed she'd just walked away with. The rental apartment never stopped feeling foreign, even after 3 weeks of unpacking boxes that somehow still left the rooms looking half empty. I answered work calls from a folding table I'd bought at a discount store, the hum of the hardware store's ventilation system below rattling faintly through the floor, a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen from the life I used to know. Rachel called on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with something I recognized as reluctant concern. "I heard something today," she said. "From Marcus, at the golf club. Diane's been telling people you were controlling with money during the marriage. That she finally got free of it." "That's not true," I said, my chest tightening. "She managed most of our personal accounts. I barely touched them." "I know," Rachel said. "But it's spreading, Tom. People are starting to repeat it like it's fact." I sat with that for a long moment, the particular sting of watching a lie take root faster than any truth ever seemed to. That night, I pulled up old banking records, searching through years of joint statements until I found exactly what I needed, years of transactions showing Diane's near-total control over our personal finances, my own limited access clearly documented in the account history. I photographed the relevant pages, forwarding copies to my own private email, the way I'd started doing instinctively with anything that might matter later, though I still didn't fully understand what I was preparing for. The next morning, I called Marcus directly. "I heard what Diane's been saying." "I figured there was more to it," he said carefully. "You always seemed pretty hands-off with the finances, honestly." "I have the records if you want to see them," I said. "I believe you, Tom. I just didn't want to say anything without knowing for sure." It wasn't much, but it was something, the first small crack in a story that had started spreading faster than I could keep up with. That afternoon, I drove past our old house out of habit more than intention, slowing without quite deciding to as I passed. A large real estate sign stood planted in the front yard, bright red letters reading "Sold," the transaction apparently already closed less than a month after the divorce finalized. I sat at the curb for a moment, staring at the sign, something uneasy stirring beneath my confusion. We'd bought that house for its space, its yard, the room to grow into over decades. Diane had always talked about staying there long-term, about raising grandchildren in the same rooms our daughter had grown up in. Selling it this fast made no sense, not for someone planning the kind of settled, comfortable future she'd always described. I called Rachel again that evening. "The house already sold." "A month, Rachel. That's fast, even in a good market." "Maybe she just wanted a fresh start," Rachel offered, though her voice carried less certainty than the words themselves. Or maybe she needs the cash faster than she's letting on, I said. Rachel was quiet for a moment. You think something's going on? I don't know yet, I admitted. But it doesn't add up. That night, I pulled the old patent folder back out, spreading the pages across my small kitchen table, reading through the original filing more carefully than I had in years. The process had been mine, developed in a rented garage 2 years before I'd even met Diane, filed under my name alone, long before our business together had ever existed as more than an idea. I recorded a voice memo, walking myself slowly through the timeline while it was fresh in my mind, the original filing date, the year Diane and I met, the year we formally launched the business together, the language in paragraph 12 I'd barely registered before signing. Future intellectual property developed under the business entity. Not intellectual property predating it. Not processes filed years before the business had even existed. My hands trembled slightly as I set the recorder down, a small, sharp hope rising beneath the exhaustion of the last several weeks. My phone buzzed. Diane, uncharacteristically, calling directly instead of texting. I heard you've been asking Marcus about our old finances, she said, no greeting, straight into the accusation. I heard you've been telling people I was controlling with money, I said. I was just setting the record straight. You really think stirring things up makes you look better? Her voice sharpened, impatience bleeding through her usual composure. People are going to believe whatever story makes sense to them, Tom. Then I'd rather they believe the true one. Just let this go, she said. For both our sakes. Don't make this messier than it needs to be. There it was again, the same phrase Patricia had used weeks earlier, now repeated by Diane herself, a warning dressed carefully in the language of mutual benefit. I'm not trying to make anything messy, I said. I'm trying to understand why you sold the house so fast, when you always said you wanted to stay there for decades. The silence on her end lasted just a beat too long. That's not your business anymore, she finally said, and hung up before I could respond. I sat in the quiet of my apartment afterward, the patent folder still spread across my kitchen table, the voice memo saved carefully alongside the banking screenshots in a growing collection I hadn't yet named but understood, instinctively now, that I needed. My private memory surfaced, unbidden, the way it always seemed to in these quiet moments, the day I'd filed that original patent, years before Diane, alone in a cramped garage, proud in a way I hadn't felt proud of anything in a very long time since. I hadn't given that pride away in the divorce. I was beginning to understand, slowly, that maybe I'd never actually given it away at all. The vulnerability passed, replaced by something steadier, more focused, as I gathered the documents into a single folder and set it carefully aside for the following morning. Whatever Diane needed cash for badly enough to sell a house she'd once sworn she'd never leave, I intended to understand exactly how deep it went, and exactly what she thought she'd actually walked away with in that settlement. I called my old business attorney the next morning, a man named Gerald Whitfield who'd handled the company's legal matters since its earliest years, long before Diane and I had ever needed a divorce lawyer at all. Tom, he said, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from me. It's been a while. How are you holding up? Honestly, not great, I said. But I need to ask you something about the original patent filing. The manufacturing process, from before the business even started. I remember it well, he said. You were so proud of that filing. Practically lived in that garage for months getting it right. The settlement included a clause about future intellectual property developed under the business entity, I said. I need to understand if that could have somehow included the original process. There was a pause on his end, papers shuffling faintly in the background. That would depend entirely on the specific language used, and how it was drafted. Can you send me a copy of the agreement? I photographed the relevant pages that afternoon and sent them over immediately, my hands steadier than they'd been in weeks despite the uncertainty still churning beneath the surface. Gerald called back within 2 hours, his voice careful, measured. Tom, this clause is oddly specific. it doesn't just cover future development. It includes language about processes utilized in current business operations, which is broad enough that a less careful reading could mistakenly include your original patent. Could Diane's attorney have known that when they drafted it? That's the question, isn't it? Gerald said. Either it was a careless drafting error, or someone specifically wanted that language broad enough to create confusion later. I sat with that for a long moment, my chest tight, the fluorescent light of my small kitchen suddenly feeling too bright, too clinical for the magnitude of what he was suggesting. I need to know for certain, I said. Is the original patent legally protected, regardless of what that clause says? If the filing date predates the business entity's formation, and predates your marriage entirely, yes, Gerald said. No settlement clause can retroactively claim ownership of intellectual property that existed before the relationship the settlement is dissolving. That's fairly basic patent law, Tom. Whoever drafted this either didn't understand that, or didn't care. Relief and fury tangled together in my chest, sharp and disorienting. Can you help me formalize this? I asked. I need documentation that's airtight. I'll pull the original filing records and prepare a certified summary, he said. Give me a few days. In the meantime, Tom, has Diane mentioned anything about using that process in a new venture? Not that I know of, I said slowly. Why? Just a hunch, he said. I'd start paying closer attention to what she's doing with the business side of things now that the divorce is finalized. I hung up and sat in my small kitchen for a long time afterward, the patent folder still open in front of me, a question forming that I hadn't considered until Gerald raised it. I called Rachel that evening. Have you heard anything about Diane starting something new? Business-wise? Actually, yes, Rachel said slowly. Marcus mentioned she's partnering with someone. A manufacturing startup, I think. He said she seemed really excited about it, talking about some proprietary process they'd be using. My stomach turned over slowly. Proprietary process. That's what he said. Why, does that mean something? It might mean everything, I said. That night, unable to sleep, I drove past our old house again, the sold sign now replaced with a sold, closed sticker slapped diagonally across it, final and complete. I sat at the curb, my hands resting on the steering wheel, and let myself feel, briefly, the specific ache of watching a life dismantled so efficiently that barely a month had passed before every trace of it had been converted into cash and new beginnings I hadn't been invited into. My private memory surfaced again, gentler this time, Emily, our daughter, 6 years old, riding her bike up and down that same driveway, insisting I watch every single lap even though I'd already watched a dozen before her. She was 23 now, living out of state, mostly quiet since the divorce, caught uncomfortably between two parents she clearly didn't fully understand anymore. The vulnerability passed slowly, heavier this time, but I let it move through me fully before setting it carefully aside. I called Emily the next morning. Hey, sweetheart. I don't want to put you in the middle of anything. I just wanted to ask, has your mom mentioned a new business venture to you? She hesitated. A little. She seems really stressed about money, actually, more than she's letting on. She mentioned something about needing the house sale to close fast because of investor deadlines. Investor deadlines, I repeated slowly. I didn't think much of it, Emily said. Dad, is something wrong? I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. But I think I'm starting to understand why. If you've ever found the one detail everyone else missed, buried in fine print you were told to sign and move on from, you understand why receipts matter more than rushed reassurance. Stay close, because the truth was only beginning to surface. I drove to the storage unit that held the rest of my old business files that weekend, the smell of dust and cardboard thick in the enclosed space, searching methodically until I found everything Gerald would need: original lab notes, dated prototypes, early correspondence about the process, all of it predating Diane by years. My hands trembled slightly as I photographed each item, not from uncertainty anymore, but from the particular electric focus of finally understanding exactly what I was building toward. Gerald called 2 days later. The certified summary is ready. Tom, I think you need to see this new venture Diane's involved in directly. I have a feeling the timeline is more urgent than either of us initially realized. Gerald's office smelled the same as it always had, old books and stronger coffee, a comfort I hadn't expected to need until I was sitting across from him again. I did some digging, he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Diane's new venture is called Meridian Manufacturing. Her business partner is a man named Curtis Ashford. They've been courting investors for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks, I said slowly. That's before the divorce even finalized. Correct, Gerald said. Which raises questions about timing I don't think either of us can ignore. I opened the folder, flipping through printed marketing materials, investor prospectuses, all of it built around language that made my chest go tight the moment I read it. Proprietary manufacturing process, developed exclusively within the founder's prior business venture, offering significant competitive advantage in efficiency and cost reduction. That's my process, I said quietly. The one from the garage. Before we even met. It appears they're representing it as company-owned intellectual property, Gerald said. Which would only be accurate if that settlement clause actually transferred ownership, and as I explained, it legally can't, given the filing predates your marriage. Does Diane know that? That's the question, Gerald said. Either she genuinely believes the clause covers it, or she's knowingly misrepresenting ownership to investors, which carry significant legal exposure. I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling slowly into place. That evening, Diane called, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard from her since before the divorce proceedings had turned adversarial. I heard you've been talking to Gerald, she said. I wanted to explain, before this becomes some big misunderstanding. Explain what, exactly? The clause was standard language, she said. My attorney included broad terms to make sure the business division was clean. I only wanted a clean break for both of us. A clean break where you keep everything and I keep nothing, I said. Including a patent that was mine 2 years before you and I even met. You don't know what it's been like, starting over on my own, she said, her voice softening further, an attempt at vulnerability I recognized now as calculated rather than genuine. Curtis and I have worked so hard on this. I just assumed the business assets included everything tied to the company's operations. Assumed, I repeated. Or hoped I wouldn't notice. Her tone shifted instantly, warmth evaporating into something sharper. You're being paranoid, Tom. This is exactly why things got so hard between us. You always assume the worst. I have a certified patent filing predating our marriage by 2 years, I said. That's not paranoia. That's documentation. She didn't respond to that directly. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear background noise on her end, a restaurant, maybe, glasses clinking, low conversation. I need you to stop representing that process as company-owned in front of your investors, I said. Before this becomes a much bigger problem for both of us. I can't just stop mid-negotiation, she said, panic finally bleeding through her earlier composure. We close with investors in 10 days, Tom. This isn't something I can just walk back. Then you have 10 days to figure out how to fix a mistake that was never actually yours to make, I said, and hung up before she could respond further. I sat in my small apartment afterward, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from the particular electric charge of watching a carefully built life finally begin to show its cracks. My private memory surfaced, unbidden, the day Diane and I had officially launched the business together, 5 years into our marriage, her excitement genuine then, unmistakable, before whatever had shifted between us had quietly begun eroding everything we'd built. I let myself grieve that memory briefly, the particular ache of watching something once real curdle so completely into something built on misrepresentation and rushed deadlines. The vulnerability passed slowly, but steadier resolve settled beneath it as I gathered my thoughts for what came next. I called Rachel. She's 10 days from closing an investor deal built partly on a patent that isn't hers to offer. Tom, that's serious. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure the investors know the truth before they sign anything, I said. Gerald's helping me prepare formal documentation. If Diane won't correct this herself, I will. Do you think she knew? Really knew, when she inserted that clause? I thought about the careful specificity of the language, the way it had been broad enough to create confusion but precise enough to survive casual scrutiny. I think she at least suspected, I said slowly. I think she was counting on me being too exhausted after the divorce to read the fine print carefully. She miscalculated, Rachel said. She did, I agreed. Now I just need to make sure the people about to invest real money understand exactly how much. Gerald called the next morning with an update. I found the law firm clerk who processed the original settlement paperwork. She's willing to speak with us, off the record, about how that clause came to be worded the way it was. Will she confirm it was intentional? I don't know yet, Gerald said carefully. But given the timing of Diane's new venture, and how specifically that language was drafted, I have a strong suspicion this wasn't an accident. I sat with that for a long moment, the full shape of the betrayal beginning to assemble itself into something far more deliberate than I'd initially wanted to believe. Gerald arranged the meeting with the law firm clerk 2 days later, a woman named Beatrice Coyle who'd processed the settlement paperwork and had apparently been thinking about it uneasily ever since. We met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near the courthouse, Beatrice's hands wrapped tightly around her cup, her eyes darting occasionally toward the door. I shouldn't be here, she said. But I've thought about your file more than I should have since it closed. Just tell me what you remember, I said. The clause about intellectual property, she said slowly. It wasn't standard language. Diane's attorney had me revise it 3 times, each version broader than the last. I remember thinking it seemed unusually specific for a settlement that was supposedly straightforward. Did Diane's attorney explain why? He said his client wanted to make sure all business assets, current and prior, were fully captured. I assumed that meant assets developed during the marriage. I didn't realize it might be interpreted to include something predating it entirely. Would you confirm this formally, if asked? I asked. She hesitated, glancing down at her coffee. If I'm asked directly, under oath, I won't lie. But I'm not going to volunteer this on my own. I need this job. It wasn't everything, but it was enough, one more voice confirming the deliberate shape of what I'd been slowly piecing together for weeks. That afternoon, I drove to Diane's new office, a sleek space downtown with Meridian Manufacturing's logo freshly painted across the glass entrance. She looked up from her desk when I walked in, her expression flickering through surprise before settling into practiced composure. Tom. I wasn't expecting you. You sold something that was never yours to sell, I said, standing in her doorway, my voice even despite everything churning beneath it. That's not what happened, she said, though the denial came too quickly, too automatic to hold real weight. I have the original filing date, I said. It predates our marriage by 2 years. I have a certified summary from Gerald. I have a clerk who remembers your attorney insisting on broadening that clause 3 separate times. Her face went pale, the composure she'd maintained through every previous conversation finally beginning to crack. You don't understand the position I was in, she said, her voice dropping. Then explain it to me. Clearly. Right now. She sat down heavily, her hands pressed against her face for a long moment before she finally looked up again. Curtis and I invested everything into this venture, she said. The house sale wasn't enough. We needed something proprietary to attract serious investors, something that would make Meridian stand out immediately. I told myself the clause was broad enough to justify it. You told yourself, I repeated. Knowing it probably wasn't true. She didn't deny it. Her silence, sitting there in an office built partly on a lie, confirmed everything the documents already had. How much have investors already committed? I asked. 200,000, pending final closing, she said quietly. In 10 days. And Curtis? Does he know the patent isn't actually secured? No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He thinks it's fully ours. If this comes out before closing, the whole deal collapses. Everything we've built over these past months, gone. You should have thought about that before building a company on something that was never yours, I said. Please, Tom, she said, something raw slipping through her composure for the first time since I'd known about any of this. I did what I had to do to survive this. The divorce left me with less than I expected, and I panicked. You had the house, Diane. The accounts. Half the business we built together. That wasn't less than expected. That was nearly everything. She didn't respond to that, the silence between us heavy with everything neither of us had fully said aloud until now. There's an investor meeting, I said finally. Before the deal closes. I want to know when. Her eyes widened slightly, panic flickering behind them. Tom, please. Don't do this in front of Curtis, in front of the investors. Let me fix this quietly, on my own terms. You had 10 days to fix this quietly, I said. You spent them hoping I wouldn't notice instead. I turned and left her office, my hands steady despite the storm still churning beneath the surface, and sat in my car outside for a long moment before finally starting the engine. Rachel called as I pulled out of the parking lot. How did it go? She admitted it, I said. Not everything, but enough. She built this entire venture partly on my patent, knowing it probably wasn't hers to use. What happens now? Now I find out exactly when that investor meeting is, I said. And I make sure everyone in that room understands the truth before real money changes hands based on a lie. I drove home through streets that felt different now than they had just weeks earlier, the particular clarity of finally understanding the full shape of a betrayal settling into something steadier than the shock and grief that had carried me through the divorce itself. Gerald called that evening. I found the investor meeting date. 6 days from now. Tom, if we're going to do this, we need everything airtight before you walk into that room. The 6 days before the investor meeting passed in careful, methodical preparation, Gerald and I meeting almost daily to build a case that would leave no room for confusion or doubt once presented. There's one more thing you should know before we go in, Gerald said, 2 days before the meeting, his voice measured. I did some additional research into Curtis Ashford. He's invested his own retirement savings into this venture. If the deal collapses, he loses more than just a business opportunity. I sat with that for a moment, an unexpected wave of sympathy for a man I'd never met, someone else apparently trusting Diane's version of events completely, unaware of how shaky the foundation actually was. Does that change anything? I asked. It shouldn't change the facts, Gerald said carefully. But it might change how we present them. This isn't just about you and Diane anymore. There are real people whose futures depend on the truth coming out clearly, and soon. I thought about Emily then, caught uncomfortably between two parents, and made a decision. I want to tell Curtis privately, before the meeting, I said. He deserves the chance to understand what he's actually invested in before it becomes a public spectacle. Gerald nodded slowly. That's fair. It also protects you from looking vindictive if this ever needs to go further legally. I found Curtis's number through the company's public listing and called him the next morning, my hand steady despite the uncertainty of how the conversation might unfold. Mr. Ashford, my name is Tom Whitmore. I think we need to talk about the manufacturing process Meridian's been representing to investors. There was a pause on his end, then careful curiosity. I'm listening. I laid it out clearly, methodically, the original filing date, the settlement clause's legal limitations, Beatrice's account of the deliberately broadened language, everything Gerald and I had spent days assembling into an undeniable timeline. Curtis was quiet for a long moment after I finished. She told me this was fully secured. That there was no ambiguity whatsoever. I have certified documentation, I said. I can send it to you directly, before the investor meeting, so you have time to understand exactly what you're actually walking into. Send it, he said, his voice tight now, something shifting audibly in his tone. I need to see this for myself. I forwarded everything within the hour, and Curtis called back that evening, his composure entirely different than it had been that morning. I confronted her, he said. She admitted the ownership was disputed. She said she was confident it would work itself out before closing. He exhaled hard. I've put my retirement into this, Tom. I can't afford confidence. I need certainty. I understand, I said. That's exactly why I wanted you to know before the meeting, not during it. I appreciate that, he said quietly. More than you probably realize. The morning of the investor meeting arrived clear and cold, sunlight cutting sharp angles across the downtown office building as I climbed the steps toward Meridian's conference room, Gerald beside me, the folder of certified documents heavy and certain in my hands. Curtis met us in the lobby, his expression grim but resolute. I've decided to let this play out in the meeting itself. The investors deserve to hear it directly, and Diane deserves to face it in the room where she built this lie. We entered together, the conference room already filling with investors in sharp suits, coffee cups steaming on the polished table, low conversation humming with the particular energy of people about to commit significant money to something they believed was solid. Diane stood near the head of the table, her presentation materials arranged neatly, her composure fully intact until she saw me walk in beside Curtis. Her face drained of color, the professional smile she'd been wearing faltering instantly. Tom, she said carefully. What are you doing here? Making sure everyone in this room has accurate information before they sign anything, I said, my voice steady despite the tension building in the space around us. The investors exchanged uncertain glances, the earlier warm energy of the room shifting into something more cautious, more alert. This was never about a clean break, I continued, opening the folder Gerald had prepared, setting the certified patent filing on the table for everyone to see. It was about the patent. About using something that was never legally transferred in our divorce settlement to build a company you're currently asking these people to invest $200,000 into. That's not accurate, Diane started, her voice tight, but the room's attention had already begun shifting away from her toward the documents now circulating slowly around the table. You inserted that clause knowing exactly what it protected, I said. Or at least suspecting it strongly enough to have your attorney revise the language 3 separate times to make it broader. One of the investors, an older man with silver hair, looked up sharply from the document in his hands. This filing predates the marriage by 2 years. That's fairly clear. It is, Gerald confirmed, stepping forward. I'm prepared to provide full certified documentation to anyone in this room who requires it before proceeding with any investment decision. The room had gone almost completely silent now, the weight of the moment settling heavily over the polished table and the coffee cups no one was drinking from anymore. Diane stood frozen at the head of the table, her prepared presentation forgotten entirely, her eyes moving between the investors' faces and the document that had just unraveled months of careful planning. I did what I had to do to survive this, she finally said, her voice quiet now, stripped of all its earlier composure. You took the house, the savings, everything else, I said. But you missed the one thing that was never yours to take. The silver-haired investor set the document down carefully. I think this meeting needs to be postponed until ownership questions are fully resolved. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table, chairs shifting as several investors began gathering their things, the earlier eager energy of the room replaced entirely by cautious retreat. Please, Diane said, turning toward them, panic finally breaking through completely. This is a misunderstanding. We can resolve this quickly, I promise you. Tom, please, she said, turning to me now, her voice cracking. Not here, not like this. You built this deal on something you never owned, I said quietly. Now everyone in this room knows it. That's not something I did to you, Diane. That's something you did to yourself. Curtis stood slowly from his seat beside her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and quiet devastation. I trusted you completely with this. My retirement, Diane. Everything I had left. Curtis, I can explain. You already did, he said. This morning, when you admitted you weren't sure the ownership would hold up. I just didn't understand then how badly you already knew it wouldn't. That was the one reaction from the room I let fully land, investors filing out quietly, the deal collapsing in real time around a company built on a foundation that had never been solid to begin with. Diane sank back into her chair once the room had mostly emptied, her earlier composure completely gone, replaced by something hollow and exhausted. What happens now? She asked quietly, not quite looking at me. Now the patent stays where it always legally belonged, I said. With me. What you do with what's left of this venture is your decision to make, not mine. I gathered my folder and turned to leave, Gerald falling into step beside me, Curtis nodding once in my direction as we passed, a silent acknowledgement of everything the morning had cost him and everything it had finally clarified. Outside, the morning air felt sharp and clean against my face, sunlight cutting through the downtown buildings in a way that felt different than it had walking in. Rachel called as I reached my car. How did it go? The deal fell apart, I said. In front of everyone. She admitted enough for the investors to walk away. Are you okay? I sat with that question for a moment, genuinely considering it rather than offering an automatic reassurance. I think I actually am, I said slowly. For the first time since the divorce, I feel like I'm standing on something solid again. 3 weeks later, the patent's ownership was formally reaffirmed through official legal channels, any lingering ambiguity in the settlement clause clarified and corrected. I used part of the licensing income to open a small workshop of my own, modest but entirely mine, built on the same foundation that had started everything years earlier in a cramped garage. Emily visited the following month, running her fingers along the workbench, smiling in a way I hadn't seen from her since before the divorce had complicated everything between us. This feels like you again, Dad, she said. The version I remember from before everything got so complicated. I sat that evening in the quiet of my new workshop, the original patent certificate framed now on the wall above my desk, the same document that had once nearly disappeared into a settlement clause no one had bothered to read carefully enough. I thought about how close I'd come to losing it entirely, buried in language designed to slip past exhaustion and grief, and felt something settle fully into place, not triumph exactly, just the quiet, steady relief of finally standing in a life that was honestly, completely mine again. If someone ever tried to take something from you through fine print you were too exhausted to read carefully, tell me how you found your way back to what was actually yours. Share your experience below. And for more stories like this, subscribe to Family Betrayal Verdict.